So I have a problem. See Exhibit A. Luke, can you go to the next slide? This is a very similar conversation that I have. Me. Jesus, should I buy this new book? Jesus says, show me the latest new books you have read. And I say, I have no new books I have read. And he says, you are right in saying, I have no new books I've read, for you have 26 new books, and the ones you now own you have not read. We have a very beautiful bookshelf in my office, covered from ceiling to floor with beautiful books. It covers 1.5 walls with beautiful books that reflect mine and Zach's ideals, interests, and studies. A couple shelves are filled with Bibles, because that's what you give pastors as a gift, reference books, and 1,000-year-old words uttering profound thoughts about God. But the half wall is filled with volumes of poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and topic-specific writing that I can't quite stop myself from picking up when I see them. It's a costly hobby. I even have a couple stacks of books that have yet to be placed on said shelves. A stack that I knew that I needed when I attended a recent conference. Have I picked up any of them in the last 3 weeks since I purchased them? Not a single one.
We already had one of them.
We apparently already had one of them. Great minds think alike. But my soul just knew that they were mine. Among this gorgeous collection of books I have aspired to read have been these 5 books. Move the plant just a little bit. I've aspired to read these books. All of them have to do with rest. Books I have felt incredibly moved to read at a specific moment in time. You know how many I have read? 1. Actually better than 0. And that's because it was really quirky and full of wild adventures, much more narrative than how-to. The others, I got too bored to deal with the content, which was, of course, rest. I got restless reading about rest. Well, it turns out that rest, or Sabbath, as it is referred to in our scripture today, is actually incredibly difficult for me to wrap my mind around. Like, what qualifies as rest, really? Do I have to be sitting or lying down? Does it mean taking a nap? Does rest count if the children still need to be cared for? And the laundry needs to be done, and why are there always dishes in that stupid sink? And when I do meditate or pray, my mind is still running 1,000,000 miles a minute. What's up with that? I have this rest deck. You guys might recognize it. For those of you who were with us last summer, I actually shared this deck with you. There's 50 cards in here, reminders to rest and or practices that might make you feel more whole. That was the last time I looked at them. A year ago. Yeah. The meaning of these are to help cultivate rest as resistance to hustle culture. You might remember that I shared this, but I haven't looked at them since. Really helpful. So back to these books. I pulled them off the shelf and took a look. I looked through these books and there were bookmarks showing where I had stopped, because I actually have started some of these. This one is the one that I have read. It's fantastic, and I highly recommend it. It's called Wintering: The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times by Catherine May. It was a timely and lovely read, and I highly recommend it. Okay? So, read this one. It second one was Burnout. The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle by Emily and Amelia Nagoski. I only got to page 12 out of 215 because I clearly solved that whole stress cycle thing. But I do have to say there was a really long introduction, so it was more than 12 pages, but yeah. Sacred Pause is another one, written by one of my UCC colleagues. It's called Sacred Pause, A Creative Retreat for the Word-Weary Christian by Rachel Hackenberg, full of playful practices to rest. I got to chapter 2 out of 12. I haven't even gotten around to reading this one. It's called Contemplative Prayer by Thomas Merton. And the last book is Rest is Resistance, a Manifesto by Tricia Hersey. She's also known as the Nap Pastor, which is just so fabulous. And that's what actually birthed this rest deck, which take a look at it when we're done, if it makes it. I got to page 60 out of 195. In this book, I used 2 of the cards in the deck as a bookmark. This is what they say. Rest makes me hopeful, open, and tender. I will snatch some rest today. Yeah, adorable. And I am not lazy. That's fine. The next, I know, Hugo, wild. And get this, the next page where my bookmark is, the first sentence is why we are not resting. We are not resting because we are still connecting to our rest in a capitalist, trendy, consumer-driven way. The way we have been trained under a capitalist system. Yeah, our society doesn't really value rest. I don't know if you knew this. Because rest isn't productive. Rest takes us away from things that need to get done. And when you are part of the system, it is incredibly hard to believe that rest is necessary for our health and for the ways that we communicate with one another. So, as I saw this passage on the topic of Sabbath, there was a part of me that said, I need this sermon preached to me right now, not the other way around. So you'll have to have some patience with me as I explore it with you. If you know me, it might not surprise you that I want to get rest right. I picked those cards, right? We were the thing that we did at the Johnson's house that last summer was we were supposed to pick ones that spoke to us. So those were the ones that spoke to me most. But it turns out that I don't quite have the time to read books about rest. So here we are. As we approach today's scripture, it's important to understand that the practice of Sabbath was a gift from God. A break in the hustle of life. The idea of Sabbath was rooted in the Judeo-Christian creation story of a God creating for 6 days and then taking the 7th day to rest and to enjoy what God had created. The beginning of Sabbath as a practice was part of the foundation of God's formulation of the identity of the people of Israel. You'll remember, the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians, and they spent so long under those oppressors. And these were Jesus' ancestors. God put this idea of Sabbath to a people who were enslaved and not given the opportunity to rest. The bodies of the Israelites had once been enslaved, owned by others for the sake of cheap labor and production, benefiting only their oppressors at the price of exploitation and exhaustion. When God brought them out of slavery and entered into covenant relationship with them in the wilderness, this idea of rest for this formerly enslaved persons was so important that it made it in the top 4 of the 10 Commandments, which reads, "Keep the Sabbath day and treat it as holy, exactly as the Lord commanded. 6 days you may work and do all your tasks, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Don't do any work on it, not you, your sons or daughters, your male or female servants, your oxen or donkeys, or any of your animals, or the immigrant who is living among you, so that your male and female servants can rest just like you. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That's why the Lord your God commands you to keep the Sabbath day." In other words, your bodies are holy and sacred and are worth more than what they can produce. Take a day every single week to rest from your toil, to pray, to be with your loved ones, and to allow yourself to be awed at the world around you. Sabbath was a gift from God, and the observance of this practice was carried on through generations of this faithful people. As we do, we created all kinds of traditions and rhythms of life to ensure that we could, in fact, actually practice this Sabbath. Cooking and preparing our food ahead of time, so we don't have to do it on the Sabbath. Making sure that we could get all of our work done in 6 days rather than 7, which also resulted in giving the work animals a day of rest, as well as the land upon which they toiled. Productivity paused for 1 day every week, and the community took a collective rest. Well, ideally, anyway. As traditions and rhythms of life do, these practices became solidified and codified by the people. Sabbath practice had become such a significant part of the collective identity and lived experience of this once enslaved people, and you had to have a pretty good reason to break the weekly Sabbath. Typically, that was an emergency or life or death situation. People acting all willy-nilly about it were seen as treacherous, careless, and traitors even. Breaking the Sabbath was a crime. So it's no wonder that Jesus' actions, especially as a teacher of the law, in relationship to something so sacred and central to this people's shared life together, such as Sabbath, would set off alarms for those in charge of making sure the law was followed. These 2 interactions that Anne read to us, particularly those in charge of keeping order, are responses to what they saw as carelessness in disregard for the law. Now, we could explore together which specific laws they were accusing him of breaking and whether or not he was actually breaking them, because some scholars even argue that he actually wasn't breaking any laws or even permitting his disciples to break. We could even argue about whether Jesus was right or justified by his actions, whether the law said it was true, it was okay or not. There are so many conversations that could be birthed out of this story, but the one that I want to invite us into is verse 27. Jesus says the Sabbath was created for humans. Humans weren't created for the Sabbath. What might that actually mean then and even now? It doesn't seem like we have gotten away from a society that places value on unlimited hard work and productivity. Many of us work long hours, even multiple jobs to make ends meet, that the idea of making space for a day off seems laughable. And even if we do get a day off from the work we get paid for, most of our days are spent cleaning and doing laundry and other household chores or running from one busy activity or after another. This is a friend, clearly not my situation. It doesn't seem like it is any easier for us today to receive the gift that is rest. The Pharisees and the scribes and the Herodians and all these religious leaders often get painted in a very not nice picture, but it turns out we all struggle with the same thing. These two accusations of Jesus and his followers breaking the Sabbath norms are designed to entrap Jesus because he threatens the world his accusers knew and grew accustomed to. They wanted him to fall in line and continue preserving this life-giving tradition so much so that they missed the intended spirit of the thing. Matthew Skinner, professor of New Testament at Luther Seminary, writes, "The Gospel of Mark casts Jesus as honoring the purpose of the Sabbath commandment. It is as if Jesus is saying that the chief objective of the law, in general, is to save and preserve life. Indeed, therefore, what better day is there than the Sabbath, a day meant to promote God's commitment to humanity's well-being for the restoration of a man's malformed hand." Jesus wasn't against the Sabbath. He celebrated and honored this long-held tradition, but he wanted to invite people to actually take it seriously. Not in a legalistic way, but in recognition of the love of God who first created this gift. That love that is not quantifiable. Saving and preserving life comes in all forms, in literally rescuing from danger, but also in restoring relationship, making sure that everyone has enough food and water. It looks like housing the unhoused, freeing people from addiction, reminding us that we are so deeply loved and cherished by God, and that God does desire for us to rest from our labor. It looks like second chances and removing barriers from people's freedom and bondage. It looks like a pause in the hustle cycle, to recognize that we are created to be, not just to do. And it reminds us that we are all worthy of this kind of love, and that living into this kind of rest for everyone takes a collective effort, questioning the very hustle culture that demands a product from us. So I shared with you that I felt like this was a sermon that probably needed to be preached to me rather than to you. So I would like to ask you what this actually stirs up in you. How does it feel to hear that regular rest is a God-given gift desired for you? Do you find it easy to rest? What practices have you observed to ensure that you do rest and can be quiet enough to hear God's loving whispers to you? What is the wisdom that God has given you that I need to hear today?